Hello and welcome to the Hard Questions. On this episode, we focus on the Uganda-US relations. Uganda has enjoyed 61 years of a relationship with the United States of America. The US pumps nearly $1 billion into our economy every financial year. Recently, they just launched their report to the Ugandan people from the US mission in Uganda, highlighting the different success stories in terms of what has worked and what hasn't worked. But we're really privileged today to be discussing everything else, Uganda-US relations. Today, I am privileged to be hosting US's ambassador to Uganda, Ambassador William Popp. Ambassador, welcome to the Hard Questions show.
Thank you, Solomon. It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, you're just marking 5 months.
Right.
You came in September
Indeed.
20th. Today is 20th again.
Indeed.
5 years, I'm hoping you're settling in well.
Very well. It's been an honor for the day that I've been here, really, to get to know Ugandans, to go around the country. I've had the chance to visit different parts of Uganda and really connect with the Ugandan people. Yeah. And I'm just even more thrilled now than I was 5 months ago to have been able to come here and serve as U.S. ambassador.
Yeah, your predecessor, Natalie Brown, was amazing.
Absolutely.
A great time with her.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it was really great interacting with her at
Indeed.
several occasions. I've had a chance of visiting the U.S. Embassy, and proudly to say that I think that the American people have supported Uganda largely, both financially in terms also of building our capacity. But let's talk about these relations.
Absolutely.
How would you describe the US-Uganda relationship at this time?
Well, I think the partnership with the Ugandan people, Uganda as a nation, continues very strong. It has been, as you noted, for over 60 years, been a relationship that has navigated challenges, has confronted really unprecedented moments of epidemic, of violence and instability in the region, security, terrorism, all kinds of challenges, and time again weathered that and resulted in lives saved, opportunities achieved, and really a better future. That doesn't mean there aren't still challenges to work through. And obviously, when governments are working together, there's going to be areas of difference, and we have to work through those. But our commitment between the American people and the Ugandan people, I'm very confident will continue to endure.
You're pumping nearly $1 billion and supporting about 60% of our health sector budget. Has that really yielded results?
I believe it really has. Not only in HIV and fighting AIDS, which many times gets the most attention, and for good reason. There's over 1.4 million Ugandans today living with antiretroviral medicines provided by the United States. They're able to have healthy, productive lives. They're able to have children that are HIV negative. They're able to be part of not spreading the disease to other individuals. When we look at 30 years ago, 20 years ago, incidence rates above 20% for HIV, and now we see it 5%. That's a dramatic impact. But even beyond HIV, malaria, fighting Ebola, there's so many examples of how lives have already been saved, and considering what the research and the science and the work together is doing not only to confront the next challenges here in Uganda, but around the world, I'm confident we can say that millions more lives will be saved in the future as well. Yeah,
I just had an opportunity to read through this report, and I think that you highlight the investment in the education sector, the investment in Uganda's agriculture and also the economy, and also a democratic Uganda. Quite significant achievements that you have had from this report, which is amazing. Until when I believe that this relationship that we've been having, this cordial relationship that Uganda has had with the United States, and the level of investment has been a bit shocked with the passing of the Anti-Homosexuality law. I know that ever since the president assented to this law and signed it into law, there's been several reactions from the US and indeed the Biden administration, including, not to mention the different statements that have been made by Secretary Blinken and the president. And let me just quote what Joe Biden said immediately after the passing of the bill. He said, the enactment of the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act is tragic violation of universal human rights, one that is not worthy of Ugandan people, and one that jeopardizes the prospects of critical economic growth for the entire country. I join the people around the world, including many in Uganda, in calling for its immediate repeal. No one should live in constant fear of their lives or being subject to violence or discrimination. It is wrong. And this message fell to President Museveni's ears, and this was his reaction, and I quote, homosexuality is a big threat and a danger to procreation of human race. Africa should provide a lead to save the world from this degeneration and decadence, which is really very dangerous for humanity. And of course, that followed US's actions, drastic actions, including the suspension to AGOA, which we'll talk about deeply later. It also has come out with different conversations on trying to show its solidarity with this. We've had so many human rights violations in this country that have been committed. This in particular has been very core to the United States people. Why?
Well, I think this particular piece of legislation, for its extremeness, has not only captured the interest and the concern of the United States and many other countries, but people all over the world. This law, as it is goes beyond criminalizing homosexuality. It creates an environment where individuals have to report on their neighbors, on other individuals. It creates a death penalty for actions of individuals involved in same-sex relationships. It creates a dynamic that really is one of the most extreme violations of human rights that unfortunately exists around the world today. And so while the United States has been very clear for a long time about concerns around human rights, we publish annual human rights report, not only around Uganda, but countries all over the world, where we detail our concerns about this. We've spoken out about it. We've spoken out about concerns around the recent elections in 2021 and the lives lost there, closing democratic space in general. But the Anti-Homosexuality Act, as the President of the United States said in May, it creates a culture of fear around people for being who they are. And that is deeply troubling. We believe in a country like Uganda that is so welcoming, that has a culture of acceptance of others and of each other. It really harms all Ugandans. It creates the fuel for discrimination, for isolation. It prevents people from accessing medical care, accessing services, potentially due to discrimination, and that makes everyone more vulnerable, makes it more dangerous for all, and we see this as a step backwards for the Ugandan people.
Your Excellency, do you believe in democracy?
Indeed.
Well, because America is the beacon of democracy. This law, members of parliament went, they discussed it, they passed it. The president assented to it, and they went through the legal framework that this country follows. And yet you find it very comfortable for you to come and intervene in the running of the state. I think the president has called it colonialism. Why? Why wouldn't you let a country manage its own affairs? Why would the US get so closely involved in the day-to-day running of Uganda?
Well, I think it's important.
Specifically to that.
Yeah, I think it's important to clarify, first of all, it's not intervention. It's stating principles, it's stating values of democracy, of respect. These are universal values enshrined in the United Nations International Declaration for Human Rights. These are principles that we should all hold dear, and which I believe Ugandans do. Ultimately, Uganda makes its laws, and the Ugandan people choose or should have the right to choose how laws are made. However, not all laws are good, And laws that violate the rights of certain individuals by their inherent nature are undemocratic. So ultimately, under a democracy, under a constitutional order that is designed to preserve civil and human rights, a law that contradicts that by its nature deserves to be questioned. And of course, there is a legal process right now. There's Ugandans that are challenging this law in court. We, and I know many others, await what the decision will be around that law. But ultimately, we as the United States, and I know many other countries have spoken out about this law as well, see it as something that is contrary to Uganda's own interests and certainly against universal human rights of identity and self-will that individuals have to be who they are.
Ambassador Popp, you talked about challenging the law in court. Why wouldn't you let that process continue and not pull out these drastic measures, including suspension of Ugandan AGOA, reviewing funding, and all the drastic action that you have taken after the passing of the law?
Well, I think if you look at each of the specific actions, you'll see that they're tied to very concrete reasons that are timely, that do not interfere with the processes that are underway here in Uganda. For example, in the first instance, we issued a travel advisory. We have a responsibility to American citizens, including members of the LGBTQI community, to know that the law exists here, to know what the dangers are that they may face if they were to visit Uganda. We're not telling them not to visit. We're warning them to be aware of what the circumstances are. So we did that in June, and we have an obligation, of course, to our citizens, as every nation does, to ensure that they're as informed as possible. We advised U.S. businesses, companies that are looking to invest here or doing business here, that the law exists, that there are aspects that by doing business that might enforce the law here could put them at odds with laws in the United States against discrimination, for example. That there is reputational risk to doing business here under the circumstances. We're not telling people not to invest here. We're telling people to be aware of what's occurring. With the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that legislation, that law in the U.S. has requirements, and on an annual basis, that countries that comply with those requirements, those criteria, including respect for human rights, respect for democracy, comply with that and then therefore qualify. If they do not, they are automatically disqualified from the benefits for the coming year. So that statutory requirement occurs on October 30th, 1st every year. It is something set forth in our law. So when October 31st came in 2023, President Biden had an obligation to inform the United States Congress that Uganda, as well as a few other countries in Africa, no longer meet the requirements or the criteria. So we ultimately did that because these are trade preferences. These are additional benefits that are given to countries for their adherence to free market principles, respect for human rights, and democratic rule of law. And when those criteria are not met, unfortunately, we have to communicate to the countries that they no longer qualify. And ultimately, that's what happened with Uganda.
Yeah, we'll talk about the AGOA just shortly.
Indeed.
The U.S. enjoys a comfortable relationship with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which countries also have similar laws, and yet we've not seen you pull such drastic measures. Are you taking advantage of the country's vulnerability because of your financial support to Uganda?
No, I don't think so. Again, this law, homosexuality has been criminalized in Uganda for many years, since before independence. This law takes that much further. Not only is it maintains the criminality of it, but goes much further, increasing penalties up to death for homosexual acts. It requires evictions of people from their homes. It requires individuals to be held criminally liable if they do not report upon their neighbors. So it adds so many more elements that go beyond what was even existing in the past under Ugandan law and under many other countries' laws. Now, it's important also, I think, to recognize we have not cut assistance. We've redirected small amounts of assistance to ensure that particularly our health aid is not subject to potential discrimination for beneficiaries. But we have made the determination that the work that we're doing together, particularly for the benefit of the Ugandan people and health and education and livelihoods, needs to go on. And so we have continued to do that. We've not used that assistance as leverage, but we have spoken clearly about the impact we believe this law is having negatively on Uganda, and what we need to do to inform that our citizens, our businesses are informed, and of course that our laws are being complied with, which in the case of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, we had to do to remove Uganda from the eligibility.
You've talked about AGOA, which many people thought was a very deep decision that the Biden administration took, and people felt that that was really unfair. Let me just do a quote here, President Biden's remarks. And he mentioned at the time when he was suspending Uganda and other countries from the AGOA list, this is what the president said. President Joe Biden said, accordingly, I have decided to terminate the designations of the Central African Republic, Gabon, Niger, and Uganda as beneficiary of the sub-Saharan African countries for purposes of section, he cites the Trade Act, effective January 2024. He also said in an executive order that Uganda, alongside other three countries, Gabon and Niger, no longer meet the requirements necessary to allow them to continue benefiting from the AGOA trade deal. And this in a way rubbed off terribly with Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, who came and reacted, saying on a televised interview, saying, that the US administration, those putting pressure on us are just wasting time. And he said that his government, pressure from external forces will be combated, and that Uganda will cultivate trade relationships with other countries. This was on a collusion course between the Biden administration and the Museveni administration. And he feels like, just like many Ugandans feel like, the Uganda-US relations are at rock bottom as we speak. How do you feel about this?
I think it's how you define the relationship and how you define the relations. Do we have a strong difference of view around this particular legislation? Are we, from the United States perspective, deeply concerned about closing democratic space, respect for human rights, concern for the freedom of independent media here? Yes. Are all these areas that we've spoken about, that we've engaged about, that we will continue to use our diplomatic channels and our discourse to try to support positive developments? Yes. These are all areas that we have to work through. Does that mean that our relationship between the United States as a nation, with Uganda as a nation, is at rock bottom? No, I don't think so. When you look at the report to the Ugandan people that you mentioned earlier, you see real work getting done and continue to be done today. After all the things we've talked about over the last several months, lives that are still being positively impacted on a daily basis. And it's not just money, right? Of course, there's money being invested in this, but it's people working together. It's Ugandans on the front lines with information, knowledge, training, resources supported by the American people that are making the difference. And we're proud to continue to be working on that. And yes, there's going to be areas where there will be challenges and difficulties and differences of opinion. But sometimes good news doesn't sell. Sometimes that gets overlooked because the focus is really on what is the point of strife. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on that major difference. That is a significant issue that matters. It matters to all Ugandans, not just LGBTQI community members.
And that's why many people have been asking Ambassador Popp, why now? Because I mean, the violations have been committed in the past. The US perhaps would give sanctions to some of the people who are committing these violations. This time round, they decide to make a very drastic decision that could affect the last farmer in this country.
Well, I think in part, this law is a continuation. It's emblematic of what's been a deterioration. And we've reached a point where we have to take action. In the case of AGOA, we could no longer certify, the President of the United States could no longer certify that Uganda met those requirements, not just because of the AHA, but because of other aspects as well. So in a number of ways, this has been a path, this has been a process that has led us to where we are. At the same time, I think regardless of how one could examine or analyze the past, the point is the present. The present is these threats are here. Individuals are suffering. We're seeing literally hundreds, if not thousands of people evicted from homes, faced with situations of fear, not being able to access medical services, being scared to do so. Some people choosing to have to leave Uganda. These are all concerns that I think we have to deal with in the present. Our hope is that they can be dealt with. Our hope is that there's a positive way forward that leads to individuals' rights being respected, and not, again, just for the LGBTQI community, but for Ugandan democracy as a whole, for all Ugandans to feel like their rights are being respected and that they have access to information that they need, that their vote and their ability to participate in elections and in governance is respected. All those things are part of a functioning, healthy democracy that we hope will continue to advance here in Uganda.
There's just a general feeling that the US and indeed the West is trying to shape our democracy rather than supporting us to actually shape our democracy.
I think if you take a look at the report, for example, you'll see practical ways that we're supporting Ugandan democracy, Ugandans to participate in their process, local government to be able to support transparency and tax collection so that they have more resources to provide better public services to the Ugandan people. So those are very constructive ways. Those are ways that you're transforming democracy into action, into public services, into results for the Ugandan people. And that's our goal. Our goal with our assistance is not to be in a permanent assistance mode, to hold leverage over a particular country. Our goal is to help a country develop and to graduate from that so that Uganda, in this case, can have a brighter future for all Ugandans on its own.
Yeah, the president feels different because he said that he will only trade with countries that respect us. And so by the time he says respect us, this is a general feeling that perhaps the US is not respecting us. And I think this was in a reaction to President Joe Biden. The other thing that really caught many of us by surprise is the advisories that you gave out. And I think you mentioned them earlier. You gave a level 3 notice, travel notice to the people of the United States. And some people described the language used there as very hard. You also gave advisories to the investors in the country. And one of the statements that was made is calling Uganda highly corrupt and therefore not very good for a conducive environment to invest. You also gave a high-level security 3 to people traveling, and you asked them to reconsider traveling. These advisories paint a picture of a Uganda which is in flames and therefore not worth to be visited by the Americans who perhaps would come in as tourists, and we have, make some money out of the tourism sector. Does the US share this with the government, or it just comes off as that because the government of Uganda has come out to rebut some of these advisories and it sends shockwaves? It's the American government, for example, for heaven's sake, that is telling people reconsider investing in Uganda. That's a deep statement. Reconsider traveling to Uganda. That's a deep statement. You don't say that for a country that has a good relationship with the other, do you?
No, we actually issue these advisories for every country in the world. There are different categories. In the case of travel, there's 4 different categories, all the way up to telling Americans don't go to a place. In this case, as you note, we're just encouraging Americans to reconsider. Look at the information, look at the circumstances, make your decision based upon those circumstances. Ultimately, American citizens are going to choose what to do based upon the information that they have. But we, again, have an obligation to report what is facts. This law exists, the AHA exists. If you are LGBTQI, whether you are Ugandan, American, or any other nationality, you're subject to that law, and you should be aware of that. Businesses, if they're going to do business here, need to be aware of not only the provisions of that law, but that corruption exists. I don't think that's news. That is unfortunately something that has been widely reported on, and is something that a business needs to take into consideration if they are doing business. We're very clear. We don't tell businesses not to come here. We tell them to be aware of what's their environment that they're going to be operating in. We have a piece of legislation, law in the United States called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits an American company anywhere in the world from engaging in corruption. So if they engage in corruption in any country, anywhere else, they are actually subject to prosecution in the United States. And so we have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure American companies know that if they are going to operate in a country that has high levels of corruption, they need to be extra careful to avoid getting ensnared in that.
And what does that mean for our investment climate? For a country that is trying as much as it can to attract investors to come and put money into the economy, including the Americans, and the US Embassy in Uganda is releasing statements that Uganda is highly corrupt and you should reconsider.
There are American companies that are invested here today. They're doing business here, and we help them do business here. But they are also aware of the risks that they have to take, the legal representation that they need to have, the laws that they need to follow, because they have a responsibility not only under US law, but under Ugandan law, not to be involved in corruption. But they need to go in with their eyes wide open and be aware.
Travel level 3 advisory. You're advised not to travel to Uganda.
Reconsider.
Reconsider. Would you say that for a country you call a friend?
Indeed, yes. If you look at our travel advisories around the world, they do not reflect the relationship that we may have with a country. They reflect the conditions and the circumstances. It can be crime, it can be health, it can be terrorism, it can be legal, it can be a range of issues that American citizens need to be aware of in order to consider when they're making travel arrangements, regardless of whether we have a good or less good bilateral relationship between the governments. So I think we're very consistent with that. It is usually something that is criticized. We recognize that by either host governments or host country tourism agencies or industries, because they see that as something that wards people off from traveling. That's not our intention. Our intention is to make sure people have the most information possible to make an informed decision. Because if they have trouble later on, they're of course rightfully going to come to the United States authorities and say, why didn't you tell us? We didn't know, etc. So we do have that responsibility to our citizens, as countries all over the world do, and often issue these types of advisories for their nationals as well.
And speaking of that, you talked about anti-terrorism. Sometimes the US releases statements on Uganda's security situation and warning Americans in Uganda and those abroad about the delicate situation, security situation. And sometimes you just read them and like, oh, so what does the what do Americans know that we do not know, or our security doesn't know? And we then begin to think, are we safe? Even us as Ugandans. And yet government on several occasions has come out to dismiss those are advisories. Do you share intelligence with government? I mean, Americans are here. They're saying, look, we have sensed something and we are speaking to our people to be very careful, raising the security alert on terrorism. It means they've picked this intelligence. And before even the government can come out to speak about something like that, the Americans are already speaking out. And we get to question, if you have seen it, have you shared it with the state for the better interest of Ugandan people? Do you share this intelligence information with the government, or do you just look out for your people?
No, we absolutely do share that information with the correct host nation authorities. We have established channels to be able to do that. And it's up to the government, in this case Uganda, how to use that information, how to interpret it, and make decisions based upon it. And we do the same. Again, we have a set standard under our system, which is if we have that information, not only do we need to share it with the partner country, but we also have, in detail as much as we can, but we also have to share the information with the American public. So we call it no double standard, which means we must make sure that Americans know that there is a threat, especially if it is time, place specific, or it is something that is can be use that information to help people make decisions that might make them safer. We're obligated to share that information. So while of course we're not going to reveal detailed intelligence to the public or what have you, that only helps the bad guys. We obviously hold our obligation very seriously, that when we are aware that there's information that could lead, for example, large gatherings during this time period, or this location or this area has been subject to increased, potential terrorist activity, we've got to let people know that, because if they go to that area and then there's something happens, we would obviously have been able to potentially prevent that from occurring. So we have to share that information. Just because something doesn't happen that week or that period or that location doesn't mean that a threat didn't exist. But ultimately our goal is to save human lives, to protect people, Ugandans, Americans, people from any background that might be subject to terrorism. Terrorists are the enemy of all of us. And so we should be continually working not only to share that information, but to be taking the precautions that prevent them from engaging in their acts of terror.
On the flip side, this rubs off well for government, because they feel these statements affect our tourism deeply. When State Department speaks, not only the Americans pick it up, the world picks it up. And many of them, we've had cancellations, so many cancellations as a result of some of these advice.
Depends on how you look at it, because the terrorism acts, if they occur, are what truly disrupt tourism. So if you can prevent those from happening through good coordination, through informing the public, through taking action, that actually, in the long run, protects the tourism industry. We recognize many countries, including the United States, has significant benefits from tourism, from business travel, from educational travel, et cetera. Our goal is first and foremost to save lives, but it's also protect that economic positive impact that comes from people-to-people exchanges. So I think, again, the short kind of initial reaction to these warnings is, oh, you're trying to hurt tourism, or you're trying to hurt a particular country. No, what we're trying to do is prevent terrorism, and that's good for Uganda, it's good for the region, it's good for the world.
Uganda has been at the front line of pushing back on terrorism. In fact, there's great relationship on that front in terms of security, including the US investing in over $170 million per year in military assistance. There's been that relationship between the American people.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that number.
This is 2016.
2016, yeah. It's much lower now.
Yeah, that was back in 2016. I just got this. But yeah, the US has been supporting or also investing in military assistance to Uganda. Is the Uganda security system still relevant to US's interests in this region?
Well, I would start by just pointing out, yes, the amount of assistance, security assistance, has gone down significantly. It's about 1/10 of what you just described, around $17 million
Why?
a year. Well, a number of reasons. I think one, a lot of the assistance in 2016 in that period was during the period of the Lord's Resistance Army and all the challenges in northern Uganda. We've also, at the time, were heavily investing in supporting capacity for deployments to AMISOM, now ATMIS in Somalia. So factors have changed, but we've also had requirements reviewed due to concerns about human rights protection. Obviously, concern around violence in the 2021 election and other reports of actions by security authorities that our Congress has determined means we are not able to provide the same amount of assistance that we can or were able to in the past. So we've seen assistance change in the security area. It is now very focused on human rights protection, support of transparency, rule of law in the security services, and peacekeeping, particularly, again, for supporting peacekeeping operations in Somalia. So there is oftentimes a misunderstanding that there's large amounts of security assistance, lethal assistance. It is no longer that way. Security assistance is much more health, transparency, human rights, and peacekeeping support for Somalia.
Does that scare the US, this reduction in financial and military assistance to Uganda, especially that it's the big brother within the region that tries to manage conflict within the region, both in the Horn of Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also had a boot on ground at one time in South Sudan. Do you think that will affect Uganda's potential to do peacekeeping within the region? And is this the interest of the American government?
I don't think so. I think, again, the targeted support we're continuing to provide helps in specific capacities. Being able to move to Somalia, for example, being able to move forces in the need of an emergency, having the training to be able to respond in moments of crisis, those capacities we can continue to support, again, with respect for human rights, respect for capacity building that helps Ugandan forces work at the community level constructively in the communities that they're operating in. All that's good. I think that's the type of support that the United States is uniquely able to help with, that can help Uganda continue to be a force for stability, for peace in the region, and for hopefully ensuring and protecting human and civil rights for all people in the region.
The National Unity Platform president, Robert Kyagulanyi, has been on a tour in the United States several times and asking the US government to stop providing military assistance to Uganda. Could this be one of the reasons why you're rethinking your financial and military assistance to Uganda? Has this caught your attention?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is if you look at the budgetary numbers, it's been going down for a number of years, for several years. And again, it's a reflection, I think, of a number of factors that I mentioned earlier. In part, again, concern and focus on respect for human rights, but also different capabilities, different capacities that are needed where we feel like we can make a constructive contribution. It's also important to note that all US security assistance, whether it's for military or for police, has to go through human rights vetting. So every individual, every unit that receives any form of assistance, lethal or non-lethal, and all of our assistance now very focused on non-lethal, all that must be vetted under what we call the Leahy Law. And that ensures that no individual that's been implicated in any violations of human rights can receive any US assistance.
Ambassador Popp, with what you just mentioned, Uganda, the US's support to Uganda in terms of military assistance is going down over the last maybe 5 years. You're having the US issuing travel advisories on terrorism, security level 3, the investment climate on corruption in Uganda. You're dealing with so much, and you're coming at a time when the relationship between Uganda and the US is nosediving, for lack of a better word. How has this been like for you coming into this position at such a time as this?
Well, I think first, that's what diplomats do. We work through the challenging times. We have an obligation, of course, to convey what our government's positions are, but also to transmit what the host country sees from their perspective as the issues at hand. And so that's what myself and my colleagues at the mission continue to do. We work on a daily basis with the Ugandan government, but also with other parts of Ugandan society to continue to advance a broad-based agenda. And while there are challenges, as we've talked about, and there is big areas of different views that we need to work through, the underlying ballast, the underlying foundation of the relationship between our two peoples continues. And it continues to produce positive results of the work that we have together. Not only the report results that we talked about earlier with health and education and creating jobs and all those things that are very, very important, but we continue to work together for stability in the region, for peace, security, refugees. Uganda is the #1 country in Africa for receiving refugees. And the United States is the #1 funder and contributor to supporting those refugees and the communities of Ugandans that receive those refugees. So while there are the challenges that you note, there's also a lot that we're achieving together in spite of those challenges.
On several national and international televised interviews, the president seems to be bringing in Russia and China closer as this relationship between the US and Europe becomes very delicate. He's drawing his attention to Russia and China, and this is very evident in the way we vote at the United Nations. I mean, let's talk about the US's statement, a decision on the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, when you expected the US allies to all stand up and be counted for what the US was pushing for. Uganda decided to be on defense and not deciding where they fall. Even then, at different United Nations resolutions, Uganda's position has not been so much supportive to what the US is saying. And several times, the interest or the relationship between Russia and China and Uganda is getting more solid than ever. Does this scare you?
Well, of course, Uganda, like any country in the world, has the right to make relations with any country that they want. That is part of international relations. What the United States wants to do is focus on what we can do together between the United States and Uganda, and to continue to be a partner with the Ugandan people on a daily basis for the betterment of Uganda and consequently for the United States. The United States and the region, the world is better off when Uganda prospers. So our goal, regardless of with who Ugandan government has relations with, is to continue to work for shared objectives of greater prosperity, greater health, job creation, education, livelihoods for the Ugandan people, because as the Ugandan people benefit, Uganda will benefit, the world will benefit. And we believe over the long haul, Uganda will continue to see the benefits and the opportunities and the results and the successes of working closely with the United States.
All right. One of your jobs is to give a detailed diplomatic report to Washington.
Yes.
And I know that you closely are monitoring the relationship between Uganda and Russia. This is an open secret. We had the Foreign Affairs Minister of Russia coming in. The relationship between the NRM government and Russia is quite solid. Even the Defense Ministry with the Defense Minister of Russia, this remains on your radar. At what state are you in with that relationship, that growing relationship?
Well, I think Russia as a whole, under Vladimir Putin, continues to represent in its activities, its invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned earlier, its involvement through what was Wagner here in Africa, in resource exploitation, in fomenting conflict, all very worrisome, troubling, threatening actions and behaviors. That's not good for any Africans, including Uganda. And given those circumstances, I think we hope that Uganda and other countries around the region will seriously consider the risks and the negatives of working with entities that are fomenting a violent war, invading another country at this very moment, and been involved in supporting violent actions and resource exploitation through proxies like Wagner around the continent.
Yeah. Maybe because the president says, well, the support from Russia and China doesn't have a lot of attachment, just like the support from Europe and the Americans, who really bring in aspects of human rights and all this. And they do not get involved into the internal running of the country, rather than just providing this support. The American support comes with some restrictions, and you have to observe human rights. Our money is tied to human rights and all that. And the funding and support, according to Yoweri Museveni's government, from Russia and China is more of development support, and therefore not involving themselves into the day-to-day running of the state.
Well, I think evidence shows around the world, countries that have more open societies, that respect human rights, that respect independent media, that protect space for civil society, non-governmental organizations, that include citizens in the decision-making process and the holding of accountability of their governments, are more prosperous, they're healthier, they're more peaceful, they're more stable. So when development partners focus on those issues of democracy and governance, transparency, fighting corruption, protecting human rights, it's because not only are those important universal principles and values that we believe we should all continue to support, but they have direct positive developmental impacts. Countries that are more corrupt, countries that where violations of human rights are more pervasive, where participation in government is less, inevitably are more unstable, more violent, more impoverished, more subject to pandemic and resource conflicts, etc. So there is a connection there in terms of investing assistance, but also attracting private investment, which is truly the motor of development. Ultimately, countries don't develop based upon assistance alone. Assistance is a catalyst. It helps address specific issues potentially, but ultimately the private sector and private investment and entrepreneurship and small business creation and formalization of the economy is what creates prosperity. And none of that's possible without respect for human rights, fighting corruption, and strong rule of law.
Yeah, interesting conversation. Let's shift gears and talk about something that I know the US Embassy, just like any other embassy, is quietly following. The transition question, the power transition question in Uganda has been the talk of the nation over the last couple of months, and everyone is interested in it. We have a serving military officer, son of the president, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who has expressed himself as wanting to go for the top job. It's not usual that a serving military officer in the US will just wake up and say, oh, I want to be president. There's some protocols and some things that you have to follow.
Laws.
Yeah, laws that you have to follow for you to be a head of state. We have a general in the National Army who has explicitly come out to say he wants to get actively involved in the politics. In fact, he started different campaigns. I know you've been closely monitoring that situation. Of course, we have the Bobi Wine question or the Robert Chagulanyi question. who is going across the country and across the world mobilizing support to remove who he describes as a dictator. The transition question has been one that everyone is quite following. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, the transition constitutionally in Uganda is the 2026 election, or the election after that in 2031. There is a mechanism constitutionally enshrined in Ugandan law for election and for selecting the next leader of Uganda. And as with any democracy, I think it's incumbent upon the citizens of the country and those that support the citizens of that country to ensure that they are able to participate in that process as voters, as candidates, as informed citizens, so that they can make the choices of who's going to govern them for the subsequent term. So ultimately, from the United States perspective, what matters is that there's the conditions and the framework for free, fair, peaceful, credible elections here in Uganda and frankly every other operating democracy around the world. The United States is having elections in a few months. That is part of our democratic process as well. And elections are always, in a democracy, periods of uncertainty and debate and high emotion, but ultimately they are what makes they're the lifeblood of democracy. They are what makes democracies democracies. They are the opportunity for citizens to select who is going to govern for a fixed amount of time. So we are hopeful that the process building up to the 2026 elections here will permit all parties, all candidates, all citizens to be able to participate in ways that are transparent, that respects constitutional rights of being able to organize, run, be informed by the media of Uganda, have access to information so people can make the decision of who they would like to lead them.
I just wanted to go back to General Muhoozi Kainerugeba's question. He has tweeted out several times expressing his support for Russia, and at the peak of the Ukrainian war, he tweeted quite closely and he said that our support is with the Russian government throughout this crisis. This must have rubbed you wrong as the US.
Well,
a serving military general in the Ugandan army expressing openly his support for Russia in an invasion that you call in the Ukrainian invasion that you have stood up against.
Yeah, I mean, our view from the United States is we should all be supporting freedom. We should all be supporting self-determination and sovereignty. So when one country, in this case Russia, invades another country, that is a violation of international law. That is in violation of the inherent principles of international relations that have existed for a long time. We've seen horrible acts of violence, allegations of war crimes committed by Russian forces. We've seen countless thousands of people die needlessly for this invasion by the Russia of Ukraine. We're coming up on the 2-year marking of the initial invasion in February of 2022. And so I think we should all reflect on how many people have died because of territorial ambition of Vladimir Putin without any basis under international law. And frankly, only through the bravery of the Ukrainian people and the support that they've received from democratic countries around the world and freedom-loving peoples around the world is that Ukraine still exists today. And so the commitment of the United States is we will continue to support the Ukrainian people as much as possible. Our hope is that other countries will do so as well.
Yeah, but you have a general in the Ugandan army expressing his support for Russia. Again, did this rub you wrong as the American?
I think it's unfortunate. I think it's something that, again, we hope that Uganda and other countries around the world will see that this war should stop. It should stop immediately with Russia exiting Ukrainian territory, ceasing its murder of Ukrainian civilians, and we hope that all Ugandan officials, all countries in the world for that matter, will reach the conclusion that 2 years is way too long for Russia to be brutalizing a neighboring country, in this case, Ukraine.
All right. There's a general feeling within the NRM government that America is throwing its weight behind Robert Chagulanyi, who is the National Unity Platform president. Has this caught your attention?
That's not true. We don't have candidates. We don't select individuals to lead other countries. This is a choice for the Ugandan people that we hope the Ugandan people have all the freedom, all the space, all the information to be able to make their decision to vote individually, that vote will be respected, and that under the Ugandan constitution, the next leader of the country will be chosen. But the United States does not and never will have a candidate for any Ugandan election or any other election around the world. Our hope is under democracy and under democratic principles that individuals in their own countries as citizens have the right to choose who their leaders are going to be.
All right, let's talk about elections as we wrap up this interview. Your Excellency, I know that the American embassy is doing some scenario building ahead of 2026 and what is most likely going to happen. Get a brush and paint for me. Which scenarios are you looking at?
Well, I think it's impossible to look too far into the future and really say that you know what's going to happen or what could even happen. I think if anything has taught us over the last few years, particularly through the COVID-19 pandemic, but many other factors, it's very, very, very hard to assess all the potentialities and all the circumstances. What's much more anchored, I think, and what is much more realistic is to determine what you believe is a viable, strong course of action and what is best for supporting democracy, prosperity, well-being. And in this case, again, elections are the path forward in any democratic rule of law society. So our hope is that the process can adhere to Ugandan law, that as many people can participate as possible, that people are as informed of their options as possible, and that they have as many options as candidates choose to present themselves as options. That is democracy. We see it in our country, in the United States. It's not always a beautiful process. It's not always an easy process. It's a process that can generate a lot of uncertainty and tension and debate. But those aren't bad things in and of themselves if they lead to people being able to exercise their will and participate in a process and be assured that their voice was heard, even if their particular candidate didn't win. In an election, only one person can ultimately win. The point is it a free, fair, transparent, credible process in accordance with the governing law? And that is what we hope, that is what we want to support, and that is, I think, what would be best for Uganda to ensure that this democracy takes root and that the space is available for all Ugandans to be heard.
Wow. All right, as we wrap it up, I wanted to just get your thoughts on, and you mentioned about it, 2026. We're counting down. The election calendar is already out. We're going to the elections. Most of the times you have observers that go out. Sometimes there's a general feeling that the American government does not openly come out to give their observers reports openly to the people and speak about what they have observed. They rather than slide into the spiral of silence. in terms of giving the observer reports. Is the US going to be closely monitoring Uganda's elections?
Absolutely, and we do normally make statements after elections, not only here in Uganda, but in other countries where we do observation. But we also support, where we can, domestic observation, international organizations where they're invited to be able to participate in observation. Free, fair, peaceful elections, credible elections should be observed, including in the United States. We have observation in the US as well. It's normal, it's natural, it gives confidence. Everyone who runs, the ones who ultimately win, the ones who may not prevail and lose, they all benefit by having observation. It helps enhance the credibility, the confidence, the transparency of the process, and ultimately whoever is selected has more legitimacy, more capability to implement the processes and policies and promises that they made in the campaign trail, because people know, yes, that vote, the votes counted, that's who was actually elected, and that's who's been chosen. Maybe I wasn't the person that voted for him, but my neighbor did vote for them, or someone else did. A majority of fellow citizens did. So observation has a constructive role. The US, to the extent that it is allowed here in Uganda, we will support whatever way we can, because we will be carefully watching what happens, because we care about Uganda. The report to the Ugandan people that we've cited a few times during this conversation underscores how much we care about the well-being of the Ugandan people, why it matters that to the American people that the Ugandan people advance. We have a long-standing friendship. Ugandans living in the United States, Americans here. Maybe I'll just mention, I've been traveling throughout Uganda, meeting so many Ugandans, but I've also been meeting Americans all over the country. Americans who have lived here, in some cases for decades, dedicating their lives to working shoulder to shoulder with the Ugandan people. So it's not just the American government, but the American people are committed to a better future for Uganda, and part of that better future is free, fair, peaceful, democratic elections.
Yeah, as we discuss elections, we're reminded of the Capitol Hill attack. And many people raise the question, does the US have any moral authority to now talk to us about elections after what happened during the Capitol Hill attack by Trump's supporters?
I mean, ultimately, democracies, we're not a perfect democracy either. There are no probably perfect democracies anywhere in the world, because they're human processes. What we strive for is rule of law. What we saw with the horrible actions that occurred on January 6th was accountability. First of all, the claims of individuals about the 2020 elections were handled in court. More than 60 cases around US courts all over the country. Not one of them determined any questioning of the results of the elections. And those were done by independent judges, judges appointed by Democrats and by Republicans all over the country. Secondly, the individuals that were involved in the mob violence on January 6th have faced prosecution. Some of them continue to face prosecution for their criminal acts. Those are vandalism. Those are acts of violence against other citizens, including law enforcement, including against staff and members of the legislative branch. So those are ways that we've tried to work through and address transparently what was a threat to democracy on January 6, 2021. It means we're not perfect, but it means we continue to work on those issues, and with humility, with respect, without claiming we have all the answers. We want to try to support Ugandan democracy. Learn from our experiences. We are open to sharing those. We continue to bring Ugandans and people from all over the world, and we'll do so again in 2024, to see our elections, journalists to cover those elections, so that we have as much transparency on them as possible, so that we will, as our founding documents, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, enshrine, that we work to form a more perfect union, We're nearly 250 years as the United States in this democratic experience, and we're still working to make a better future for our country and hopefully help other democracies around the world do so as well.
That was so humble. What a way to wrap up this interview. What does the future look like?
I'm an optimist. I believe that if we continue to work together, there are so many Ugandans here that give me optimism. I've seen it on a daily basis. People committed to helping their neighbor, to helping their community, to building a better future. Incredibly hardworking people, incredibly committed individuals. So when I go out, I'm going to be traveling next week again, seeing some of our projects, but meeting Ugandans in action. So even on the days when there's bad news, even on the days when there's a lot of focus on the challenges, it's easy just to look out the window. It's easy to go talk to Ugandans and feel inspired. And the United States is inspired to be able to be a grain of sand in that effort of tipping the scales towards a more positive future.
Wow. Ambassador William Popp, thank you very much for speaking to us on the Hard Questions.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Appreciate it. It's an honor and look forward to future conversations as well.
Me too. Thank you very much. And I wish you a great stay here in Uganda.
Thank you very much. All the best. God bless.
All right. I've been speaking with Ambassador William Popp, US's ambassador to Uganda, on different issues around the Uganda-United States relations. I'm Solomon Serwanja. Thanks for watching. This is The Hard Questions.